I think that the essence of Anne Morrow Lindbergh still speaks to us through her writing. One source said she transformed her life into literature. I kind of like that one. Before there was Elizabeth Gilbert with Eat, Pray, Love on a journey to India, Italy, and Indonesia to find balance in life and personal peace through solitude, there was Anne Morrow Lindbergh going to a Florida beach, Captiva, to find balance in her life, and showing us how a channeled wealth reminds us of the simplicity we need to live in grace, that inner spiritual harmony, and how the moon shell reminds us of the solitude needed to find one's true center, and that this is a continuous process done alone. Before there was Eckhart Tolle with A New Earth, talking about discovering the freedom and joy of a life lived in the now. There was Anne Morrow Lindbergh for decades in her letters and diaries describing her struggle to live in the here and now so that she would extract more out of life. And learning about this, she explained, when she was traveling with Charles, but alone in the back cockpit. And even before there was Joseph Campbell extolling us to follow our bliss in order to become a whole person, there was Anne Morrow Lindbergh telling us that one must become whole through the growth of the heart, the mind, and the spirit. And even before there was Joseph Cameron spending endless time and money on his movie on Avatar, which is a movie that fuses really man and nature. There was Anne Morrow Lindbergh in a Life magazine article talking about ecology and our planet, saying that the artificial split between man and nature has been responsible not only for many of the physical, social, and economic troubles of our time, but it has also resulted in great moral and spiritual distress. Of course, her best-known book, most popular book, is Gift from the Sea. Today it sells more books than all the other Lindbergh books combined. So many of her basic thoughts are embodied in this book, and as I mentioned, a lot of them are just as valid today as they were in 1955. Along with simplification and balance and solitude necessary in one's life, she talked about the notion of intermittency. Actually, she picked this up from Saint-Exupery, the idea that you don't or can't love someone every day, every year, over long periods of time in the same way. And overall, she says that the shells remind us the sea recedes and returns eternally. This whole notion of the cycle of life was very important to her. Anne Morrow Lindbergh had a fascinating and accomplished life. She came from great wealth. She married the world's most famous hero. She was a pioneering aviator, and she was a significant writer. But what I've realized is that most people don't know much about her life. Many people think that she just wrote Gift from the Sea. The line from my one-woman play says, "Most people believe I had only one child and wrote only one book, but I gave birth to 6 children and 13 books. I'm not sure which was more painful." Anne was born in 1906 to parents who believed strongly in education. In fact, her mother graduated from Smith College in 1896. Later, she was a trustee and acting president in 1941. It's interesting that Smith College, a women's college, didn't even have a female president until 1941. It was Jill Kerr Conway. Well, while Anne's mother was at Smith, she met Dwight Morrow, who was working his way through Amherst. He then went on to Columbia Law School. They both came from humble beginnings, but they were both very ambitious. In the 1920s, Dwight Morrow was making more than $5 million a year as a partner at J.P. Morgan. Dwight was later appointed senator from New Jersey, and it was rumored that he would be the Republican presidential nominee in 1932. Unfortunately, he died in 1931 of a cerebral hemorrhage. Mrs. Morrow inherited $9 million, and it's said that the taxes that she paid that year to the state of New Jersey kept the state in the black. And so Anne Morrow Lindbergh grew up with great privilege. There are 3 important elements that were influential early in her life. First, she said her mother stopped everything she was doing at 5 o'clock every day and read to her children. Later, Anne used this time to write in her journal and continued that 5 o'clock tradition later in her life. Second, Anne said that in the Morrow family, an experience was not finished until it was written down or shared in some way. And so she begins to write. And in her lifetime, she must have written thousands and thousands of letters. Third, she said very early on that she was on a quest to find what she called real life, the kind of life that doesn't come from privilege. And this notion absolutely permeates her writing from her early letters and diaries. Well, Anne described herself as the shyest, most self-conscious adolescent who ever lived. She attended Misshapen School in New York City, and then she attended Smith as well. She met Minna Curtis at Smith, who was her writing teacher and mentor, and became a lifelong friend. Minna helped Anne find her voice, and Anne flourished. When she graduated from Smith, she won the 2 most prestigious writing awards at the school, and those 2 awards are still given to this day. Even though Anne came from a life of books and Charles came from a life of action, she told one biographer, "My life began the day I met Charles Lindbergh." They met in Mexico City at Christmas time in 1927, the year of Charles' famous flight. Her father had just been appointed ambassador to Mexico by President Coolidge, and the country needed to improve relations with Mexico. So Dwight invited Charles down to Mexico City because he had been appointed to the Aviation Board by the president, and he thought that would be a good way to enhance the relationship. So Charles accepted the invitation and flew the Spirit of St. Louis to Mexico City at Christmas 1927. Well, when Anne met Charles, it was love at first sight. She was more than smitten. In fact, in the Severide interview, it's very charming. She says, "I didn't say a word." And so he remembered her because of that quiet demeanor. It's interesting to note that when Anne graduated from high school, she answered a questionnaire that asked, "What is your life ambition?" And she said, "I want to marry a hero." And so she had met her hero. Well, it took Charles 10 months to call, and of course, everyone thought that he'd be calling Elizabeth, Anne's older, most charming sister. And Anne recalled later that all 3 of the Morrow girls had fallen in love with Charles on that trip. Well, they went flying on their first date. Charles had prepositioned a de Havilland Moth plane at Falaise, the Guggenheim estate on the bluff overlooking Long Island Sound. It's a beautiful spot. 3 days later, he took Anne and her mother's secretary on a flight in a Ryan Brown plane out of Teterboro, New Jersey. Well, that night, Anne and Charles went for a drive in Charles' Franklin motor car, and they became engaged. Her parents were quite surprised. Her father had promoted Charles prior to the Mexico trip, saying he doesn't womanize or drink, and now he was asking, well, what do we know about this man, Lindbergh? And a few months later, when their engagement finally was announced, her mother said, "Anne, you'll have this guy." They were married at her parents' home in a surprise ceremony. There were only about 20 people there because the press had the house staked out and they had been already stalking them. So they snuck out of the house to go on their honeymoon, and the press stalked them unrelentingly, not only on their honeymoon, but for decades afterward. Early on in her life, Anne said that she considered herself a devoted page serving her knight, a role she could play until she grew up. Well, we'll see, she did grow up. Their youngest daughter, Reeve, said that each of her parents described their relationship as an inexplicable connection. And for the first few years that they were married, Anne followed Charles in his life of action. They flew together everywhere. Anne learned how to fly from Charles, who was an exacting teacher. She learned in a blue biplane that Charles bought because he said it could land in a tree. Charles continued with Anne's lessons and arranged for her membership at the Long Island Aviation Club, a flying club near Roosevelt Field on Long Island. She was his co-pilot, navigator, and radio operator. And this is the Morse code kind because that was the technology of the day. And of course, she said she wanted to do all of this as well as a man could. Before their 2 famous survey trips, they flew across the United States many times, including on the inaugural trip for TAT, Transcontinental Air Transport. And then in preparation for their 2 survey trips, Charles ordered a new airplane from Lockheed in California. And this was the first aircraft to have an enclosed cockpit. It had a sliding canopy, which was quite new at the time. So they went out to California to pick it up. And this was the trip when she earned her glider pilot's license. She was the 10th person to have one and the first woman. Charles was the 9th person to have a glider pilot's license. Well, their 3-week trip turned into 3 months. Finally, they returned in the spring, making one fuel stop in Wichita. And at 14 hours and 45 minutes, it did cut off 3 hours from the previous speed record. And then there were the 2 famous survey trips. Charles worked for Pan Am to chart air courses around the world. He had pontoons put on the airplane because there was water everywhere, but there weren't very many airports at the time, so they could take off and land in water. In 1931, they spent 3 months going to the Orient, which is described in her book, North to the Orient. This was a best-selling book in 1935, and at the time, sold 185,000 copies, and it's still in print today. And then in 1933, they took a 30,000-mile, nearly 6-month trip in a big circle around the Atlantic. Her book, Listen the Wind, describes just 9 days of that trip. Charles said that in some ways that trip was more dangerous and difficult than his Paris flight. In 1934, Anne was awarded the prestigious Hubble Medal from the National Geographic for those 2 trips. She was the first woman to receive one. The award started in 1906, and it's only been awarded for 23 events. Sometimes it's been given to a team of people, but only for 23 events since 1906, and Charles received the award for his Paris flight. Well, when they lived in Europe for 3 years, they traveled together extensively. This is between 1936 and 1939. And it was during a trip at this time that they flew over the Alps on their way to India and had a terrible time. They encountered fog, they were low on fuel, it was getting dark, and one of their main instruments failed. Anne thought surely she was facing death. 7 years later, she took this experience and wrote The Steep Ascent. They returned from India in April. 5 weeks later, May 12th, was Coronation Day for King George VI. This is King George of the King's Speech, King George. It was also the day that she gave birth to her 3rd son, Land, just 5 weeks after returning on that trip. In the play, I talk about the protective shell of the cockpit. Anne truly loved flying most of the time, and she said it's where time stood still. While she was flying, she would either memorize poetry or recite poetry that she had memorized. And I love what she said in The Steep Ascent. And every time you land, you are reborn to the earth. In the early years of her marriage, Anne continuously left her children behind as she traveled the world with Charles. She wanted to be with him, and he insisted that she go. However, later in life, in the Severide interview, she did indicate that if she had to do it all over again, she wouldn't have left her children as much. However, in her later years, she also said that flying was the best part of their marriage. Well, from an early age, Anne wanted to write. In the 1930s, she was able to combine her unique flying experiences with her craft of writing. Her first 2 books that I mentioned, North to the Orient and Listen to the Wind, were immediate successes and put her on the literary map. She found her voice, and as she later said, it wasn't the voice of a radio operator. Altogether, she wrote 13 books and numerous magazine articles. Anne said that writing allowed her to see things more clearly, to help her find a more authentic place within herself. In 1941, when Anne and Charles were facing some pretty difficult times, she wrote in her diary about writing. She said, "One writes not to be read, but to breathe. One writes to think, to pray, to analyze. One writes to clear one's mind, to dissipate one's fears, to face one's doubts, to look at one's mistakes in order to retrieve them. One writes to capture and crystallize one's joy, but also to analyze and disperse one's gloom." And I think a lot of people, especially women today, write in a journal for those very same reasons. Anne gave a talk at Smith College in 1978. She noted that the title of her speech, The Journey, not the Arrival, was something she truly believed in. She talked about Virginia Woolf and her husband Leonard. I mentioned Virginia Woolf because I think that she must have had quite an influence on Anne with A Room of One's Own, the famous essay written in 1929 with the thesis that women must have their own money as well as complete privacy in order to write. Well, we know she didn't have a problem with the money, but she always arranged for that room, and I give her great credit in the time that she did this and the age that she was doing this, that she always arranged for that room to write. When she was first married and they were living at her parents' home in Englewood, New Jersey, she had an apartment in New York City. When they lived in England, she had a room that overlooked the beautiful gardens that she loved. And when they lived in France, they had a house that overlooked the ocean, and she had a special room overlooking the ocean. When she was in one of her rooms, the children weren't really allowed to bother her, but sometimes they did. And Charles would stand around the corner and he would whistle to her, and she would always go to him. Well, another person who meant a lot to her writing was Antoine de Saint-Exupery, or Saint-Ex. He was a French aviator and a writer. You may know him because he wrote The Little Prince. Anne met Saint-Ex once, only once. It was August 1939. Many people have incorrectly thought that this was an affair, but after this weekend with Anne and Charles, she never saw him again. She said that their connection was like summer lightning and made an indelible impression on my life. Well, they talked in French because Charles couldn't talk French, so then Anne had to translate, and Saint-Ex couldn't speak English. Saint-Ex treated her as an equal writer. He understood her and he understood her writing. She has very long passages in her diary about him, so this connection to him was very important for her. In fact, Scott Berg said that she was changed forever. When she wrote The Steep Ascent, she said it was a letter to Saint-Ex, but she never knew if he read it. It came out about the same time he was reported missing. He was a famous French aviator, and his plane went down in 1944. And in fact, it was 2004 when they found his plane off the coast of southern France. I think Anne and Saint-Ex shared a wonderful sense of humanity. In fact, she wrote the introduction to his wartime journals, which was published in 1982. Two of his quotes really stand out for me. He said that after the war, we shall have perfect musical instruments, mass-produced, but where shall we find the musician? Well, surely a defining time for Anne and Charles was when their firstborn son, little Charles, was kidnapped, March 1932. In that day, during the Depression, kidnapping was fairly common for extortion purposes. In fact, in the Chicago area, the 2 years before, there had been 400 cases of extortion by kidnapping. The event has been written about in excruciating detail and has many theories. Scott Berg said, not in his book, Lindbergh, but later in interviews that he gave, he said that he thought Bruno Hauptmann committed the crime and extorted the family for money. And he said going into it, he really thought that perhaps he would come out with a different opinion, but he did believe that Hauptmann committed the crime. Well, Anne writes about it pretty honestly in her book, Hour of Gold, Hour of Lead. 2 days after the body was found, you may know that it was 10 weeks later, and they found the body of a little Charles, and they think that he died the night that he was kidnapped, maybe fell from the second-story window, and then they found his body in the brush area 10 weeks later. But 2 days after the body was found, she wrote, "He's already been dead 100 years." Charles blamed the press and the constant stalking for his son's death. Anne told Scott Berg that she was always disappointed that she never once saw her husband cry on the death of their son, and not once. And Scott Berg said it's the most devastating line in his book. Well, 5 months after the kidnapping, Anne gave birth to John, that's Jon, their second son. She said that John's birth broke the spell over her. Life had been given back and my faith was reborn, she said. Well, Charles made for an interesting husband and father. He called the household a non-benevolent dictatorship. Reeve indicated in her books that all kinds of things were forbidden, like comic books and candy and television. They didn't celebrate Father's Day or Mother's Day unless Charles was not there, and then they did celebrate Mother's Day for her. He missed graduation, a wedding, and a couple of Christmases. Throughout their marriage, Charles traveled extensively. In the early years, Anne went with him, but after a while, she realized she just couldn't keep up, especially after they moved to Connecticut in 1944. Charles would be gone for months at a time. They didn't know where he was or when he would return. There's a new book out called Against Wind and Tide. It's Anne's letters and diaries, edited by Reeve. And they pick up where the last of the books, War Within and Without, left off, 1946 to 1986. And in this book, in the diaries and letters, it's very clear that Anne had the bulk of the responsibility for raising the 5 children, because Charles wasn't home. He would fly in and out of their lives according to what he wanted to do. In the mid-50s, each one of them had a best-selling book. Charles published the second book that he wrote about the Paris flight, entitled Spirit of St. Louis. It's up here. And it came out in 1953, and it won the Pulitzer Prize. It was made into a movie with Jimmy Stewart. You may remember that. He dedicated the book to Anne, it says, to AML, who will never realize how much of this book she has written. I've been saying for a long time that I think he learned how to write from her. And years later, she did admit to Scott Berg that she was jealous about that Pulitzer. In fact, in this latest book I just mentioned, Against Wind and Tide, there is one astonishing entry. For me, after studying all of this for so long, it's the best entry in the whole book, page 84, July 1953. She makes it very clear that she knows exactly what she contributed to Charles' book. And this comes after she had been in therapy for 2 years, when Charles did not offer any support, understanding, or sympathy with her process in the therapy. And in fact, she said that he fought her tooth and nail every inch of the way. And during these same 2 years that he didn't support her, she provided significant help to his book, and in many ways. And she said that this was even after 10 people had already done an overhaul job on the book. More importantly, she makes it crystal clear how much Charles learned from her writings and her readings, her education, her way of talking, her admiration of writers, and so much more, and that he took all of this learning from her and put it back into his book. For me, this is significant because she always, later in her life, she always talked about her life in 20-year increments. And for me now, it's almost developing as, before this letter, before she had all this backbone, because she really showed for decades, didn't show very much self-confidence. And then after this, that it's very clear she knew her worth. Well, then in 1955, Anne published Gift from the Sea, and it's been in print ever since. She said she needed to find her essential self, the person she was before marriage and children, and the person she would be when they left her. And she found it through writing. Of course, Charles was out of town for her success. Well, my journey with Anne Morrow Lindbergh has taken me to places I never thought I would be or get to, and now my journey includes all of you. And I thank you so much for being here today, and I'd be happy to take your questions.